Welcome to the Week 12 overview for Microeconomic Principles here at Rutgers University in Camden. And in this week, we're going to be reviewing, amongst other things, Chapter 16, Externalities, Public Goods, and Social Choice. One of the things we're going to be talking about is externalities and environmental economics. Make sure we remember that often when we engage in transactions or make economic decisions, second or third parties suffer consequences that decision makers have no incentive to consider. These are called externalities. A classic example of an externality is pollution. Also, when external costs are not considered in economic decisions, we may engage in activities or produce products that are not quote-unquote worth it. When external benefits are not considered, we may fail to do things that are indeed worth it. The result is an inefficient allocation of resources. Note that there are a number of alternative mechanisms that are used to control externalities. Government-imposed taxes and subsidies, private bargaining and negotiation, legal remedies such as injunctions and liability rules, sale or auction of rights to impose externalities, and direct regulation. The next section is public or social goods. And remember that in the market system, certain goods and services that people want will not be produced in adequate amounts. These public goods have characteristics that make it difficult or impossible for the private sector to produce them profitably. Make sure you understand the concept of a good that is non-rival in consumption. That is, their benefits fall collectively on members of society or on groups of members. And also the notion of non-excludable, that it's generally impossible to exclude people who have not paid from enjoying the benefits of that particular public good. Realize that there is an optimal level of provision for each public good. At this level, society's willingness to pay per unit equals the marginal cost of producing the good. To discover such a level, we would need to know the preferences of each individual citizen. So you see how difficult that could be in the fact of knowing each individual's preferences in order to accomplish this. There's also a section on social choice, and realize that because we don't know everyone's preferences about public goods, we are forced to rely on imperfect social choice mechanisms such as majority rule. So make sure you understand that there are, even though we have voting, the notion that the preferences of society are reflected in how people who are voted into office or policies are adopted is problematic. Also, that the theory of unfettered markets do not achieve efficient allocation of resources should not lead us to conclude that government involvement necessarily leads to inefficiency. Governments also fail. So make sure you realize that if you espouse the view that there are market failures and there are public goods that need to be addressed, doesn't necessarily mean that the government will provide those goods efficiently. And finally, the last section is government and the market. Defenders of government involvement in the economy acknowledge its failures, but believe we get closer to an efficient allocation of resources with government than without it. So make sure you understand the arguments that some people have. We're trying to control externalities, and by doing our best to provide public goods that society wants, we do better than if we left everything for the market. So the people who argue for government involvement say there are inefficiencies, and yes, there are issues with the government dealing with that, but it moves us closer to the efficient outcome. So make sure that you're aware of that. The next chapter we're to go over is income distribution and poverty. Make sure, number one, that it says there, one of the sections is the sources of household income. Make sure you remember that the three basic sources: people get income from wages, people get income from property, such as capital and labor, and they also get income from the government. Also, make sure you have a notion of why there are differences in salaries and income for people across households. For example, if we're talking about labor, people's skills, training, education, experience impact that. They might have different types of jobs that could be quite dangerous, and they might be compensated for that. Also, the distribution of income. Have a good idea of what the distribution of income looks like in the United States at the present time. I believe your book goes up to about 2011. So make sure you have a notion of the wealthiest people, the wealthiest 20%, how much of total income do they get, and also a notion of the people at the lower end of the spectrum, the lower 20%, lower income individuals, the 20%, how much they get. Also have a good idea of what the Lorenz curve is and what it's used for. And also make sure you realize that poverty is difficult to define. What is the appropriate poverty line for a household of four? People could argue over that for quite a long time. But have a notion of what the U.S. government thinks that the poverty line for a family of four is. And before you read that section, I always tell students to think of what you think the poverty line should be for a family of four, and then see what it actually is. Also, realize trends in income distribution, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, what happened from the 70s into the 80s, all the way up to now. Is the distribution getting less equal, more equal during certain times, less equal to others, just to give a notion of the historical trends with that. Also, this notion of the utilities possibilities frontier. All right. Make sure that you realize that, number one, that when governments try to redistribute income and wealth, they usually do this in the name of fairness or equity. Also realize, because utility is neither observable or measurable, policy decisions that are attempted to redistribute income use wealth as an imperfect substitute for well-being. So realize that when they're doing that, they're trying to redistribute well-being when they're redistributing wealth. And just have a good idea about the redistribution debate and realize that the basic issue against the redistribution of income rests upon the fact that most people believe that if you work hard, you should be able to keep what you earn. Also, the fact that there's a freedom of contract. If I have a contract to work with somebody and I work for them, government taxation imposes costs upon that contract, and also the protection of property rights, private property rights. Also, make sure you realize that there's a negative effect on incentives. Some people believe, for example, taxing heavily will make people want to work less. Taxing savings will want people to save less. And because people are saving less, they will also invest less. So make sure you understand this particular chapter. I think it's important to have a good idea about the distribution of income in the United States and some poverty issues from the view of an economist.